Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we're back again, and we're going to continue now with the second installment of my best episodes series. This is a series where I talk about some of my most favourite shows and what I deem to be the best standalone installments within those series. And we're going to talk now about Spartacus. This was an American series produced by Starz back in 2010, and it's an adaptation, of course, of the famous historical story of the slave gladiator known as Spartacus, as he leads an uprising of slaves against the Roman Republic. And this was a show very notorious for its stylized tone and violence, very much in the vision of Zack Snyder's film 300, itself a comic book adaptation of a Frank Miller storyline, where we had a lot of stylized shots of violence and characters all filmed in front of a green screen, seemingly leaping out in front of you, leaping onto the page, leaping on in front of the screen. And we have a very kind of muted sepia tone in terms of the visualization. Spartacus continues in that vein set by that movie. It was also very notorious for its highly charged sex scenes and vivid scenes of cruelty, as it really wanted to show how the slaves were being brutally treated by the Romans. And for me, this is one of the most unrated and underappreciated series, I think, overall. I think it was a ratings hit at the time, but over the years it hasn't been revered as much. One of those shows that got caught in the slipstream of Game of Thrones and Walking Dead, both shows I also believe were released in 2010. It just didn't get the same revelation and the same recognition that those shows did, even though I believe it was actually a superior show to both of those. So as I go on this list now, I am going to be talking very much spoilers, so if you haven't watched the show in its entirety, I advise you now to stop watching, go back and catch up with all the episodes within the show, and then come back and watch this review, because I'm going to be covering episodes across of all the 4 seasons: Blood and Sand, Vengeance, Gods of the Arena, and War of the Damned. So this won't necessarily be chronological order, but I will be kind of bouncing back and forth between episodes of the show in explicit detail. So I'm now going to begin my list of what I deem the best episodes. So final spoiler warning now. We're going to begin in 3, 2, 1. So the first episode I want to bring up was called Sacramentum Gladiatorium, and this was the second episode from Blood and Sand, and this was following the premiere episode Red Serpent, and this was really where the real story of Spartacus began. This is where we see him introduced to the Ludus. He's born a notoriety because of course he defected from Glaber's artillery in the first episode, and at the final scene of that episode he fought, I think it's 4 gladiators, and proved himself, and Beatz sees him as a potential gladiator that he can earn a lot of money from. And this is of course where we see the introductions of all the best characters: Onomaus as Doctore, Crixus, Asher. We see of course Spartacus befriending Varro, and of course they have to pass the various tests to test their worth and become part of the Brotherhood. And it's that typical, you know, when you get a new recruit coming to already established fraternity or organization and he gets picked on. We have those scenes of course where we see Crixus for the first time already showing a lot of antagonism towards Spartacus. That's when Spartacus faces off Crixus in the final scenes, and he bests him because he uses the cloth from Suri. Crixus slips up over it, and Spartacus then proves his worths and joins the Brotherhood. And I just think, yeah, this is just a great episode. I love all the tension, if you like, between Spartacus and Doctore in particular, who becomes across as unlikable at the beginning, but he would overall become one of my favourite characters of the show. This is of course where we get really introduced to Batiatus and his own ambitions towards escaping the role of a minister and wanting to become more into political office, enhance his own status. So yeah, for me this is just a great introduction to the real beginning of the story of Spartacus. And then we follow up with the Legends episode, and this was the 3rd episode of Blood and Sand, and we see here the intensity build up between Spartacus and Crixus as Spartacus maneuvers his way into a contest between Crixus at the arena because he wants to gain coin to aid in the search for Suri. He starts off a fight when there's an introduction where Batiatus is showing off the gladiators. I love the history of the flashback stories between Barca and Crixus when all the other gladiators are talking about how great they are, and we get those kind of very stylized black and white flashbacks where we see Barca, who's known as the Beast of Carthage, and there's that flashpoint story where he takes on his father, or seems like his father, and I just love that whole history and building up that whole mythology between the characters. And I do believe as well this was the conclusion part where we see Spartacus take on Crixus in the arena. He gets completely bested and it's deemed that he's not worthy enough, and that's when we see him lead into the pits for the next following episode. So just great action and just great building and mythology setting along this episode. We then go on to, I think, what is perhaps one of the best episodes of this season of the Blood and Sand, and that is Shadow Games. The magistrate has come forward to the Ludus to view the gladiators, and again Beatz is constantly trying to push his position and get involved in the arena for the games, and it's suggested that they have to team up to fight against the ferocious Theocles. We get the history here, of course, because it was Oenomaus was the only person who was able to stand alone and fight against Theocles and live. Everybody else has taken on him, has died, and Spartacus has to team up with Crixus. And of course this is great tension again, and knowing the already inbuilt animosity between the two. You get a great history of Oenomaus showing himself and the scar that he bore when he fought Theocles, and funny scenes as well when they're both training, trying to come at him, and he's just besting them easily. This is all great stuff on it, and this episode was also, I think, a real standout because for me it generated the fact that how brilliant John Hannah's performance was as Beatz, and for me he was forging to be one of the best villain characters, even though he's not established a villain at this point, but overall the best villain characters within television. We get that great scene, he's on the hunt, finding out who tried to assassinate him in the previous episode, The Thing in the Pit, and he's interrogating one of the, I think, slaves of Ovidius, and we get this real brutal scene when he's just swearing profanity left, right and centre, and as he is, he's battering this guy with just a cup, and we see him all bloodied and bruised, and it's like, wow, when you see this for the first time, it's like very intense. And John Hannah continued to shine on here throughout, and this is when, for the first time watching, I was really just starting to form a real likability towards Beatz. Even though he's fierce and intense, you kind of empathise with him because he just wants to find out who made an attempt on his life. So this is a real standout moment for me, and a real standout episode, of course, because we get the concluding battle between Theocles, Spartacus and Crixus. It's just a real great build up and tension as we see clouds shroud the skies, and we see everybody on edge as Theocles enters the screen. This huge hulking figure on here with blonde hair, and we get great choreography and fight scenes between Theocles, Spartacus and Crixus. Crixus, of course, gets fatally wounded. He uses the lighting on his shield to help distract Theocles, while Spartacus takes over and defeats him, and then that's when the rain pours down because Capua has been starved of any wet weather now for the last couple of days, and this is, of course, was the beginning of the concept how Spartacus bore his image as the bringer of rain, of course. So just great scenes, great action, one of the best episodes I think of the entire season. We then move on to the next episode, Mark of the Brotherhood. This was the 8th episode from Blood and Sand, and this is now following on from the very tragic event from the previous episode where Spartacus realised, or he came to the visualization of his wife Suri being killed. We know, of course, that Beatz did this deliberately because he wanted Spartacus to forget about the longings of reconciliating with his wife and embrace his life as a gladiator. And now we see this very much in the opening scenes of this episode. We see multiple fight scenes of Spartacus in the arena, fully embracing his role as the champion of Capua. And this is, of course, now where we see the new recruits being brought into the Ludus. This is the first appearance we see of Argon as well as his brother. And the roles now and the dynamic has very much been reversed because Crixus is still trying to recover from his fatal wounds against the Battle of Theocles, and it's now Spartacus who's the champion, and it's now Crixus who's the one who's very much demoted. Whereas if you go back to the Sacramentum Gladiatorium episode, it was very much Crixus who was the champion of Capua, wasn't it? And Spartacus really embarrasses Crixus in a demonstration. Crixus is trying to prove himself, and it's where Spartacus bests him in a demonstration amongst the new recruits on it. So a great role and reversal, and at the time it was a strange chemistry and dynamic going on because in a weird way, Crixus was coming the much more of the empathetic character, and it was Spartacus who was the one coming across as much more of an arrogant, sarcastic personality as he embraces the role of the champion capture. And I think that's great, just writing and characterization, how the dynamics were constantly shifting. One minute you think one person's the hero, one person's the antagonist, and in the next episode those kind of roles are shift, and it makes you just look at these characters a bit differently. And I just think that's great depth and adds layer to the characters on it, and it's fantastic. And of course this was another episode where we see the continued preference of Olivia, as Batiatus and Lucretia are trying to further themselves in position again. Olivia gets Spartacus to try and kill Spartacus, because in a recent demonstration Spartacus kind of embarrassed Olivia in front of her friends, so she didn't like that, so she tries to get Spartacus to assassinate Spartacus, and Crixus rescues him, of course, and we see a very brutal end for Spartacus without spoiling it too much. But just one of my favourite episodes, as we see the roles and dynamics forever changing between the characters. The next episode we have is A Place in This World, and this is from Vengeance, and this is the second episode. And I like this episode a lot because it focuses a lot on Oenomaus, who at this stage has really lost his purpose, and indeed, as per the title, his own place in this world. The rebels now have spread out into their hundreds, and Spartacus is trying to get them together. And Oenomaus, if you know from the Blood and Sand finale, is a free man, so he can kind of walk around as he pleases, and he really is searching for direction. And we see him going back and visiting the arena, and the opening part of this episode we see him where he's now fighting in the pits, and he's constantly defeating all of the opponents, and he's just asking them to bring out more, because he just now sees only one way, and his ending and his depth. And what I like about this episode, because we get a great backstory into Oenomaus, where we see him when he's younger, before he came to the Ludus, and he's kind of this wild animal. Again, he's fighting in the pits, and we get a welcome reappearance of Titus, Batiatus' father, and we see him attain the services of Oenomaus, and we see the bonds that they forged together, and we get an understanding of their relationship and how much Oenomaus kind of rose to prominence within the Ludus and became one of the best gladiators ever. And I just love it. I love the backstory. Oenomaus is one of my favourite characters, and it's great to see again Titus. He was a great actor and a great performance, so I just love seeing the origin story of Oenomaus and how we came to fruition. This of course was a very famous episode because we saw the reappearance of Asher at the end, and of course Crixus continues to lead the search for Navia. So just another great episode and further development for Oenomaus. We go on to the next episode, which is Monsters, and this is from Vengeance. This is the penultimate episode, episode 9, and we see on here now Olivia and Lucretia try and manipulate Sepia because she wants to gain revenge against Glabber, who murdered her brother Sepius before. And this is a really intense episode because we now see both Olivia and Glabber coming to realise that they are one and like, they are both monsters, and this culminates in the scene where Sepia tries to murder Glabber and Olivia saves him at the last minute. She stabs Sepia at the back, and there's this blood just pouring everywhere in the bath. And then after the deed, Olivia and Glabber proceed to have sex over Sepia's dead body, again just emphasizing the fact that how dark and deranged and what a dark place they've both come to now at this stage, following all the trials and tribulations that we've seen them throughout this whole entire season. So just great work on here, great performance from Viva Bianca as Olivia now, who really became her own prominent character. She was more, if you like, the folly, if you like, all of Lucretia in Blood and Sand, but she's really come forth here into her own ambitious personality within this episode. This episode also had the fact that Varius had come back leading an attack against Spartacus, and we had spectacular action here as the Romans were bombarding the slaves' fortress. Varius gets killed in a ball of fire, of course. Glabber leads the troops against Spartacus. We get them fighting off against Glabber's men. Asher's men come to the fore. We get that battle scenes between the tall Egyptian and Oenomaus, of course, and Oenomaus sadly gets stabbed in the eye, and Spartacus in the end has to retreat with his troops, and we get that best line from Glabber at the end where he says that they will kill them all. That's of course a reference to that line which is used variously throughout Blood and Sand, and particularly at the end, which is the season finale of Blood and Sand. So just a great episode, great character development on here, and again just showing that Spartacus, despite the protagonist of the show, really was an ensemble. It was really the supporting characters that were the much more of the complex and more interesting of the show rather than the lead. And again, this showed again the likes of Gladiator, Lithia, Asher really coming forward to the forefront and furthering their own ambition. So another great episode on here. We go on to the next episode, which is Decimation. This is from War of the Damned. This is the 4th episode, and this is following from the previous episode where Tiberius had led an attack prematurely against Spartacus, going against the orders of Crassus, his father, and as a result they retreated, and Crassus doesn't like this because it makes him look bad against his first encounter against Spartacus's forces. So he looks to seek punishment against the people who retreated, the soldiers, by enacting the very famous process of decimation, where you get soldiers fighting against each other, and the people who survive the battle against each other get to live out their days into the Wanderers camp until Crassus deems them worthy. And of course this heightened the tension between Crassus and Tiberius, his son, because one of Tiberius's most loyal subordinates gets lumped in the soldiers who have to fight for their lives, and Tiberius unfortunately has to take his life in order to him be survived, because he was lumped into the decimation as well. And this is kind of again Crassus trying to teach his son the ways and trying to treat him as a man, but it just completely backfires. And I love this episode because I love the fantastic scene of the decimation itself. We get the great boom in music as we see Crassus lining up all his soldiers. He gives this great speech about how they deserted their camp. No one can go against the orders of Marcus Tullius Crassus. I love the performance from the actor who plays Crassus. I just love the music and the build up and the setup and the tension throughout this scene. And again, it does great setup between the animosity built in between Crassus and Tiberius. Just great action and great staging alike on here. Other features of this episode, of course, was that Caesar infiltrates the city group of rebels, and he begins to set the seeds for division amongst the camp. But just great episode, and again just building up the force and the presence of Marcus Crassus. Great episode on here. The next episode we talk about is Beneath the Mask, and this is the 4th episode from the Gods of the Arena season. And here now we go back to the prequel story where we see Batiatus and Lucretia continuing to gain favour in the Primus by hosting a party for people important in the Roman state. And of course this is when Titus, Batius' father, has come into play, and he's really put a hold on all the messing around and machinations of Batius and Lucretia. So Batiatus has to lead his father away. He gets them to look at other slaves that they want to bring to the Ludus, and Lucretia holds a party kind of where everybody's now coming into the pleasures of the house of Batiatus, and they hold a great party on it. At first everything's going all good, but then of course Tullius comes into play, and of course that means trouble. He stages an exhibition against Gannicus. Gannicus is a bit wounded on here, and then Gaia, as well as looking for her own advancement, she tries to help out Lucretia and Batiatus by making sure that Tullius rather doesn't say anything about what goes on the house of Batiatus. Tullius doesn't like this, so he retaliates by brutally murdering Gaia. We get that brutal scene where we see Lucretia discover Gaia's head getting bashed in, and of course she's very upset and vengeful because she had a great bond with Gaia and she saw her more as a sister. And I love the last scenes of this episode where we get the discovery. We see Titus coming in, and he's very called for and saying he's the dominus of the house, and you know, see it done. And they have to cover up, of course, Gaia's body, and this upsets Lucretia a lot. I love all the tension throughout, and we get that critical scene, of course, where Titus tells Batiatus that he has to see him on proper path, and one of the stages of this is dissolving his marriage with Lucretia. And we get great musical scenes where we see them throw Gaia's body over the balcony. We see a great performance from Lucy Lawless as Lucretia is upset by this, and I love just the musical composition as we see the visual shots of Lucretia looking over the balcony, very much her heart set on revenge. Just great scene, just great episode, and this was really building up the momentum coming into the last 2 episodes of the Gods of the Arena season. The next episode we go on to is Blood Brothers, and this is taken from War of the Damned, the 5th episode, and we continue the ongoing split now between Crixus and Spartacus. This is something they've been building up throughout the season, where Spartacus now really is trying to veer away now from taking on the Romans and trying to lead his people towards safety. His concern is more about the preservation of the people, knowing the fact that while they may have a large number of people, a lot of them are women and children and untrained soldiers. This contrasts with the mindset of Crassus, who is now very much hell-bent on taking on the Romans at every turn, and that continues the ongoing split between the 2 characters. This is the point now where we see, of course, Caesar. He reveals his true intentions, that he is a Roman, and he begins his plot to infiltrate the Romans as they infiltrate the city. Spartacus, in working with the pirates, is seemingly double-crossed, and they find themselves under attack, and then Crixus comes in at the last minute and saves them. And this is great action as we jump cut between the space pirates attacking Spartacus and Caesar trying to open up the door to the city so Crassus and his forces can set in. And this is great action, great choreography, and it brings Caesar really to the forefront. I always had a problem with this episode because the concept was, of course, they brought in Julius Caesar for this episode, and it deflated any tension because despite the show's own direction and tone, it was still staying true to the historical events. So we know Caesar is never going to die in whatever fights that we see him involved with the gladiators, and also they are trained gladiators, so Caesar shouldn't be kind of matching him and besting him in some of the fight sequences. They should be really overcoming Caesar over time. But yeah, we get great scenes where we see Caesar throwing the kind of petroleum at the gates as it sets it on fire. Now we get this really vivid explosion scene as we see the firing battering down the gates as they bash down the gate and they come in, and we get that great ending cue from Caesar when he says now would be the time to run. Just a great hook, a great kind of cliffhanger scene to get you really invested into the next episode. So just a great action and just great explosiveness and intensity alike on it, just fabulous. And that was really again the War of the Damned season really picking up its momentum. So that sums up my overall listing of the Spartacus series, part 1 of course. Part 2 will be followed very shortly. So overall, that's the overall list of my favourite episodes. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree with this listing so far? Were these amongst your favourite choices of the show, or do you think there have been other episodes within the show that you think I've missed and deserve more merit and recognition? So that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.